Welcome to a journey through some of history's most fascinating paradoxes where ancient civilizations built sewage systems that would make modern engineers weep with envy, while medieval Europeans feared bathing more than the plague itself. This is a story of human ingenuity and human folly, of remarkable achievements and bewildering missteps, all told with the kind of irreverent humor that makes the past feel surprisingly relatable. Tonight, we begin not with grand battles or royal banquets, but with the very personal, very pungent world of medieval hygiene. We're stepping into a time when people believed hot water could literally invite death through your pores, when garlic doubled as perfume, and when your neighbor might casually throw questionable substances out the window while calling it perfectly normal Tuesday behavior. But before we dive into this aromatic adventure, take a moment to settle in. Maybe dim the lights, perhaps turn on a fan for that soft background hum that modern comfort provides luxuries that would have seemed like magic to our ancestors. And let me know in the comments where you're tuning in from and what time it is for you. It's always fascinating to see who's joining us from around the world as we explore these timeless human stories. From there, we'll journey even further back to discover ancient cities so well planned they could teach contemporary urban designers a thing or two about efficiency and elegance. We'll walk the streets of Mohenjo-Daro, where every home had running water 4,000 years ago, explore the cosmic geometry of Teotihuacan, and marvel at Babylon's sophisticated urban planning that combined practicality with pure propaganda. We'll then follow the footsteps of Hadrian, the philosopher-emperor who walked across his entire empire, building walls and temples while composing poetry about mortality. And finally, we'll trek alongside Lewis and Clark as they stumble, freeze, and occasionally triumph their way across an unmapped continent, chasing Jefferson's dream of a water road to the Pacific. This isn't just a collection of historical facts, it's a meditation on how humans have always struggled with the same fundamental challenges: staying clean, building functional societies, expanding knowledge, and dealing with the unintended consequences of progress. Whether we're talking about medieval soap made from animal fat and wood ash, or ancient drainage systems that still function today, or imperial adventures that reshape continents, the story is always fundamentally human. So buckle up for a ride through time where genius and absurdity often walk hand in hand, where the most sophisticated civilizations can exist alongside the most bewildering practices, and where the past reveals itself to be far stranger, funnier, and more relevant than any textbook ever suggested. Because sometimes, to understand where we're going, we need to appreciate just how far we've come, one medieval bath, one ancient sewer, one philosophical emperor, and one muddy expedition at a time. Part 1, Medieval Hygiene, the art of strategic stench. Picture this: you're living in the 14th century, and someone suggests you take a nice hot bath. Your immediate reaction, pure terror. Not because you're lazy or particularly fond of your personal aromatherapy cloud, but because every educated person knows that hot water is basically an invitation for the plague to waltz right through your freshly opened pores. Cleanliness is next to godliness, said absolutely no one in medieval Europe. In fact, if anything, cleanliness was suspiciously close to deathliness, at least according to the medical wisdom of the time. The early Middle Ages weren't always this paranoid about hygiene. Monasteries had bathhouses. Roman traditions of soaking and scrubbing still lingered in some corners of Europe. And people generally understood that washing was, a good thing. But something shifted dramatically. Fear, superstition, and a wildly incorrect understanding of human anatomy conspired to turn bathing from a healthy habit into a hazardous gamble with mortality itself. The prevailing medical theory was elegantly simple and catastrophically wrong. Hot water opened your pores, and open pores were basically express lanes for disease. Imagine preparing for a relaxing soak during a plague outbreak and thinking, perfect, I've just turned myself into a human sponge for death. Water, in this twisted worldview, wasn't cleansing, it was treacherous. It didn't help that public bathhouses had developed what you might charitably call a reputation problem. By the 13th and 14th centuries, Many bathhouses that had once been respectable places of hygiene and community gathering had evolved into social hubs with decidedly scandalous reputations. Some operated like spas, others like brothels, and quite a few managed to be both simultaneously. When church leaders began associating bathing with sin, which in medieval Europe was an excellent way to get anything shut down permanently, the fate of public hygiene was sealed. Being naked was one thing, but being naked in hot water, that was practically sending the devil an engraved invitation for a splash. Once upon a time, in towns that didn't yet smell like a combination of horse manure and existential regret, the public bathhouse was genuinely the hub of hygiene, health, and mildly inappropriate social interaction. Inspired by lingering Roman influence, early medieval bathhouses offered warm water, communal tubs, and a hint of optimism about human civilization. These were places where townspeople could soak, steam, and chat like a medieval spa day, minus the cucumber water and scented candles. Monks, merchants, and even lower nobles used them regularly. For a brief, shining moment in human history, cleanliness was both possible and fashionable. People looked forward to their weekly scrub down the way we might anticipate a Netflix binge. Then things got steamy in all the wrong ways. By the 13th century, bathhouses had acquired a reputation for what diplomatic historians might call multitasking. Bathing became less about cleanliness and more about companionship. Some establishments began offering extra services, with attendants who were suspiciously friendly and water that had seen far too many strangers for anyone's comfort. The line between wellness and wantonness blurred faster than soap dissolving in hot water. It didn't take long for the church to get involved. Public nudity, even when paired with actual hygiene, was frowned upon. Sexual misconduct was even worse. Bathhouses became synonymous with sin, disease, and scandal in the medieval imagination. When the Black Death rolled into town like history's worst party crasher, people were more than happy to shut the bathhouses down permanently. After all, you can't spread plague through a public tub if the tub's been boarded shut and declared morally compromised. But it wasn't just sin and sickness that doomed the bathhouse, it was suspicion. Over time, bathing itself began to seem indulgent, even dangerous. The very idea of soaking your body in warm water, especially with strangers, felt like a gateway to both physical and spiritual ruin. And so, one by one, the bathhouses closed. Some were converted into bakeries. Others were simply abandoned and left to rot a poetic fate. Really, for buildings originally meant to keep people clean. Despite the church's growing horror at the sight of naked elbows and the widespread belief that a hot bath could let plague in through your pores, medieval people didn't completely abandon the idea of bathing. They just turned it into something you do once a season, or when the smell became sentient enough to file a complaint. Let's start with the nobles, because if you're going to bathe dangerously, you might as well do it with style. Wealthy people did bathe, though not so often that their rubber ducks got wrinkly. The process was elaborate. Servants would lug in cauldrons of boiling water, indoor plumbing being still centuries away. Pour it into a large wooden tub lined with linen sheets and sprinkle it with herbs like lavender, sage, or whatever was growing nearby that didn't smell like feet. This wasn't so much a bath as it was soup you sat in. The whole operation was usually set up in the bedroom or near a fireplace, with privacy being optional depending on your level of power or shamelessness. Some couples even shared the tub, because what's more romantic than floating in each other's filth like some kind of medieval fondue? The poor bathed too, but usually in rivers, barrels, or anything that held water and didn't bite back. It wasn't about luxury, it was about efficiency. Might as well wash the kid, the shirt, and the goat all at once, was probably muttered more than once by pragmatic peasants making the most of limited resources. In winter, bathing took a definite backseat to survival. When your main concern is not freezing to death, personal hygiene becomes surprisingly negotiable. So instead of soap and water, people adopted a strategy known as pretend you're clean and just keep walking, which worked about as well as you'd expect. When full-body immersion became suspect, thanks to the prevailing belief that hot water invited disease like an open bar invitation, The medieval world turned to the next best thing, the humble sponge bath. Except they didn't really have sponges, at least not the soft, mass-produced kind you can buy at any modern store. Instead, they used linen cloths soaked in warm water, herbs, or vinegar, and wiped themselves down like they were trying to buff a stubborn stain off a very delicate chair. Hygiene in this context meant dabbing. If you were lucky, someone else did the dabbing for you. If you were noble, someone else did it while trying very hard to look like they weren't judging your life choices. These partial washes focus on the high traffic areas, hands, face, armpits, and occasionally feet, basically. The parts of the body that interacted most frequently with polite society. The real genius of medieval hygiene was the strategic use of undergarments. Layers of clothing, particularly linen shirts and shifts worn close to the skin, helped absorb sweat and grime. This meant that changing your shirt regularly was about as close to modern hygiene as most people were going to get. Your outer tunic might have been crusty enough to stand up on its own, but your undershirt, fresh as a daisy, relatively speaking. Nobody was fooling themselves into thinking this was proper cleaning. But if water was limited, or if you believed a proper bath might invite the Black Death to dinner, a cloth soaked in rose water or vinegar was the medieval equivalent of a spa day minus the spa. And really, minus most of the day. If medieval hair had a motto, it would probably be flammable but fragrant. Contrary to popular belief, people didn't walk around with matted bird nests on their heads, at least. Not intentionally. They did wash their hair, just not frequently, and certainly not with anything resembling modern shampoo. So what did they use? A variety of homebrewed concoctions that sounded like the rough draft of a witch's spell book. One popular choice was lye soap made from wood ash and animal fat, which was excellent for cutting through grease and also your scalp if used too enthusiastically. Pair that with water of dubious quality, and you've got yourself a medieval chemical peel that would make modern dermatologists weep. For those hoping to preserve their follicles a little longer, egg yolks were sometimes used as a gentler cleanser. Yes, that meant sitting in a freezing hut with raw eggs sliding down your neck while trying to convince yourself this was nourishing rather than just deeply unpleasant. Others rinsed with beer, which, if nothing else, made you smell like you'd had a wild night, even if you were just trying to remove lice. Some hair washing recipes included vinegar infusions with rosemary or lavender, which did double duty. They covered up other smells and gave the illusion of actual care. But let's be clear, no one was lathering, rinsing, and repeating. This was more of a targeted splash and squeeze operation, executed with the grim determination of someone who knew this was as good as it was going to get. Water temperature was also a concern. Hot water was believed to weaken the brain because apparently medieval people thought their heads were steam-powered, while cold water could give you plague. Lukewarm was the sweet spot, assuming you had fuel to heat water and didn't mind waiting 3 hours for a bucket that your sibling hadn't already used for something unspeakable. Dental care in medieval Europe was less about achieving a sparkling smile and more about, I still have most of my teeth. What's your excuse? To their credit, medieval people didn't entirely ignore oral hygiene. They didn't exactly understand it either, but they made a solid effort using what they had, which was mostly cloth, charcoal, and blind hope. There were no toothbrushes. That innovation was still centuries away. Instead, people used linen rags to rub their teeth clean, ideally soaked in something abrasive like salt, crushed mint, or even burnt rosemary ash. The goal wasn't whitening, it was survival. If your breath didn't knock someone unconscious at 10 paces, you were already winning. Some people opted for chewing sticks, thin twigs from trees like hazel or elm, frayed at one end to create a brush-like effect. You'd chew until the fibers separated, then scrub away. Think of it as the original biodegradable toothbrush, organic, compostable, and weirdly bark-flavored. To freshen breath, people chewed fennel seeds, cloves, or cardamom, depending on what they could afford or steal from the spice rack. In wealthier circles, you might rinse your mouth with vinegar, wine, or even myrrh water, because nothing says dental sophistication like gargling with a fluid also used to embalm pharaohs. And if you're wondering about toothpaste, It did sort of exist. Some recipes included powdered charcoal, crushed eggshells, and oyster shell ash mixed with honey or oil to form a gritty paste. If your mouth didn't feel cleaner afterward, it at least felt sandblasted. Dentists, if you could call them that, were usually barbers on their off days. If a tooth was loose, infected, or just annoying, the solution was elegantly simple: yank it out. No anesthetic, no questions asked, just a wooden chair, a strong grip, and a few hurried words to God. Aftercare included rinsing with wine and hoping your soul left your body before the infection set in. Let's be honest, if you time traveled to a bustling medieval town square, your first reaction wouldn't be awe at the historical significance, it would be gagging. Medieval Europe smelled committed to being absolutely, unforgettably pungent. There was no sewage system, no deodorant, and very few functioning bathtubs, which meant the average street smelled like a combination of sweat, animals, rotting food, and what could charitably be called optimism. If your nose survived a trip through the fish market and past the tanner's shop, congratulations, you'd already performed better than most tourists. So how did people deal with this olfactory chaos? They got creative. Enter the pomander, a small, hollow ball filled with herbs and spices, worn around the neck or tucked into clothing like a medieval Glade plug-in. These were stuffed with cloves, cinnamon, lavender, or musk, and often dipped in ambergris whale vomit, but fancy to make them smell pleasant. Think of it as carrying around your own portable air filter, except it didn't actually purify anything, it just politely overpowered the filth. Ladies often wore scented sachets in their bodices, both to mask their own body odor and to ward off the smell of others. Some even braided herbs like rosemary or marjoram directly into their hair. It was equal parts hygiene, fashion, and spiritual pest control. For those with coin, perfume was imported from the Middle East or Italy, made from rose oil or civet extracted from the rear end of a very surprised cat-like animal. Applying it involved dabbing, waving, and pretending you weren't just covering up the stench of boiled turnips in existential regret. If you've ever forgotten to wear deodorant and spent the day nervously checking your armpits like a suspicious criminal, imagine doing that for your entire life, except no one had deodorant, and everyone smelled like they'd been jousting in wool for 3 days straight. Welcome to the Middle Ages, where body odor wasn't just a possibility, it was an identity. There were no roll-ons, no sprays, and certainly no clinical strength aluminum-based antiperspirants. People simply sweated and then made peace with it, sort of. To mask or manage the musk, people employed various tricks. One common method was alum powder, a naturally occurring mineral salt that has mild antibacterial and astringent properties. It didn't stop sweat, but it could cut down on the stench, assuming you remembered to apply it and didn't mind grinding rocks into your armpits. Others used chalk, vinegar rinses, or crushed herbs. Sage, mint, and rosemary were popular not because they were particularly effective, but because they smelled like something better than you. The logic was simple: if you can't stop the sweat, at least try to smell like a salad. Perfumed handkerchiefs were all the rage among nobles, mostly so they could hold them under their noses while navigating crowded streets. No one wanted to smell like medieval stew meat, but everyone did. The best you could hope for was to smell like floral stew meat. Medieval medicine also played its part in the Great Stink. Unfortunately, physicians believed that sweating was a healthy way to purge bad humors from the body, so blocking it was seen as suspicious, possibly even dangerous. You weren't unclean, you were just medically fragrant. In a world without showers, soaps that didn't maim you, or deodorant that didn't involve shoving herbs into your armpit, medieval people turned to an unlikely hero in their hygiene routine: linen. Not to eat off of, but to wear preferably close to the body and changed before it developed legs and walked away. Linen undergarments were the unsung saviors of the Middle Ages. Breathable, absorbent, and surprisingly durable. They were worn beneath the heavier, more unwashable layers of wool and fur. Linen shirts, chemises, and shifts soaked up the sweat, grime, and everything else the human body enthusiastically produced in a world that celebrated moisture but fundamentally misunderstood soap. The logic was elegant: wash the linen, not the person. Because scrubbing your own body was risky sea plague, but scrubbing your shirt was perfectly safe. People might go weeks without bathing, but they would change their underlayer sometimes even twice a week, which by medieval standards was practically saintly. Linen was so respected that it became a status symbol. If your shirt was white and relatively clean, people assumed you had your life together. If it was gray, crusty, and sprouting mold, well, you were either poor, possessed, or recently resurrected. For women, the linen shift was essential. It protected outer garments from sweat and, perhaps more importantly, from the smell of sweat. It was the medieval version of Febreze, only less chemical and far more judgmental if not properly maintained. Knights wore linen under their armor to avoid turning into baked ham during tournaments. Monks wore it under their habits. Even peasants wore linen tunics, though usually patched, threadbare, and held together by sheer willpower and prayer. If there was one thing truly consistent in the medieval hygiene routine, it was itching. Not because people were allergic to linen or hay, though. Let's be honest, probably that too. But because they were constantly playing host to an entire traveling circus of lice, fleas, and mites. Lice were such an everyday nuisance that they were basically treated like unwanted roommates. You didn't get lice, you just had lice. Everyone did. Rich, poor, pious, drunk lice didn't discriminate. They were the true equalizers of medieval society, tiny socialist revolutionaries redistributing misery equally among all social classes. So what did people do? Well, for starters, they combed. Lice combs, often made of bone or wood, were common personal items like a toothbrush today, except instead of polishing teeth, you were raking bugs off your scalp like some kind of tiny, screaming orchard. These combs had fine, closely packed teeth designed to pull out the critters, their eggs, and most of your patience. It was a daily ritual that combined grooming with pest control, executed with the weary resignation of someone who knew this was their life now. Another method was heat treatment, boiling clothes or baking them near a fire. The heat could kill the lice, assuming you didn't burn your only tunic in the process. This is why you might see medieval illustrations of people holding up their shirts near flames. It wasn't laundry day, it was pest execution. Then there was the classic technique of shaving one's head, particularly popular among monks or those who could get away with a bald look. Removing all hair was an effective, if dramatic, solution. Sometimes a wig was worn on top, which ironically could become its own lice hotel if not cleaned properly. Still, the logic was clear. No hair, no home for the vermin. The medieval toilet, a term that feels wildly optimistic because in truth, going to the bathroom in the Middle Ages was less about comfort and more about creative improvisation and dramatically lowered expectations. Let's start with the elite. Castles had guardrobes, which were basically closets with a hole cut in a stone bench that dropped straight down, sometimes into a moat, sometimes into a pit, and occasionally into an unfortunate patch of earth that someone forgot to fence off. These were often located high up in towers for privacy and the added thrill of gravity. If you were unfortunate enough to be below one, you learned quickly not to loiter. Peasants had fewer luxuries. Most did their business outside in the woods, near the river, or behind the barn. Some villages had communal pits, essentially outhouses with very low standards and even lower privacy. Your neighbor might be in there discussing crop yields mid-squat, which really tested the limits of rural neighborliness. For nighttime needs, chamber pots were the undisputed stars of the show. These portable ceramic bowls were tucked under beds or beside sleeping areas, ready to receive contributions in the dead of night. If you've never had the pleasure of relieving yourself into a cold ceramic bowl next to your sleeping family in pitch darkness, congratulations, you're not medieval. And what did they do with the contents of said pots? They threw them out the window, literally. With a hearty shout of "Garde low," Watch out for the water. Bonte residents would dump their waste into the street below, ideally not hitting any passersby. But let's face it, accuracy wasn't guaranteed, and umbrellas hadn't been invented yet. Street sanitation was handled mostly by gravity and pigs. Cities sometimes had gutters or central ditches to carry waste away, though these often clogged, overflowed, or just sat there fermenting into a permanent neighborhood feature that everyone pretended not to notice. Toilet paper, not quite. People used rags, moss, straw, their hands, or for the very refined bits of wool or linen scraps. If that sounds unpleasant, imagine using snow in winter, because they absolutely did, before everyone collectively decided that bathing was suspicious and probably a sin. Public bathhouses were actually thriving social institutions in medieval Europe. These weren't just tubs and soap, they were the social hotspots of their day. The medieval equivalent of spas with a few extra plot twists and significantly more moral ambiguity, bathhouses offered a variety of services: hot baths, steam rooms, massage, food, music, and depending on the establishment, the occasional questionable companionship. At their best, they were communal wellness centers where people could relax, socialize, and actually get clean. At their worst, they were barely clothed dens of gossip, gluttony, and light scandal, and sometimes all three before noon. They were called stews, not because you sat in one too long, although you might, but because of the steamy water that filled them. Mixed gender bathing wasn't unheard of, especially in places like Germany or Italy, where attitudes were a bit more relaxed about communal nudity. It wasn't always risque, families could attend together. Monks sometimes bathed in pairs, but human nature being what it is, boundaries got murky. So did the water. Naturally, this made bathhouses a favorite target for church authorities. Clerics warned that bathing in mixed company led to sin, which, to be fair, it often did. Some bathhouses subtly became brothels with plumbing, where the waters got hot and not just from the fire beneath the tub. Then came the plagues and everything changed. When diseases like the Black Death struck, bathhouses were convenient scapegoats. Doctors believed that open pores invited disease. And since warm baths opened pores, well, the math added up in a we don't understand germs sort of way. Bathhouses shut down, reputations tanked, and suddenly the public bath was permanently out of fashion. Soap in the Middle Ages was a lot like medicine at the time: harsh, experimental, and likely to make you question your life choices. It technically worked, but using it felt more like punishment than self-care. The most common recipe was a hearty blend of animal fat and lye, or, if you want to sound fancy, rendered tallow and wood ash. When combined, these ingredients created a substance that could strip dirt, oil, and possibly your soul from any surface. Early soap didn't come in pleasant pastel bars with ocean breeze scents. It came in coarse, waxy lumps that looked like something you'd actively avoid stepping in. To make it, you needed patience and a strong stomach. Boil down sheep or pig fat, stir in alkaline ash water, and wait while it hardened into blocks that could probably double as construction materials. If you added herbs like lavender, rosemary, or mint, you could convince yourself it was artisanal, but mostly it just smelled like damp campfire and disappointment. Soap was mainly used for laundry and heavy-duty scrubbing, not so much for delicate body care. Skin was considered delicate, and lye soap could turn a relaxing bath into a mild chemical burn experience. Still, people used it when absolutely necessary, especially before special events like weddings, court appearances, or plague outbreaks where first impressions mattered. More refined soaps came from the Islamic world in southern Europe, particularly Castile soap from Spain, made with olive oil instead of animal fat and far gentler on human skin. These soaps were coveted luxury goods, traded across the Mediterranean and reserved for people who didn't already smell like barnyard animals on a daily basis. In medieval Europe, doing the laundry wasn't just a chore, it was a full-body workout, a community event, and a flirtation with frostbite rolled into one back-breaking experience. Forget laundromats or washing machines. If you wanted clean clothes, you had to be willing to boil, beat, and begged the weather to cooperate. Most laundry was done in rivers, which sounds picturesque until you remember that these same rivers also served as sewers, livestock baths, and the occasional body disposal site. But hey, running water was running water, even if it occasionally ran brown. First, you soaked your linens in lye or urine, yes, actual human urine, collected in pots and stored until it reached peak potency. This delightful substance was known as chamber lye and was valued for its ammonia content, which helped lift stains and whiten fabric. The smell was less helpful, but in a time when perfume was optional and hygiene was interpretive, it did the trick. After soaking, clothes were dragged to the river, scrubbed against wooden boards or large flat stones, and then pounded with paddles, a method known as fulling. It was less gentle wash cycle and more clothes interrogation. This process could take hours and often involved the collective effort of washerwomen who were both feared and admired for their terrifying arm strength. Then came the rinsing, the wringing, and the drying, which, if it rained, meant waiting another day and hoping your shirt didn't develop sentience in the meantime. Clothes were often spread across bushes, hedges, or stretched on lines between trees, giving peasant villages the charming aesthetic of a never-ending yard sale. After 14 chapters of scratching, scrubbing, sniffing, and surviving, the question must finally be asked, did medieval hygiene actually work? Or was everyone just one unwashed tunic away from spontaneous combustion? The short answer, it worked well enough. Not by modern standards. Of course, if you were to time travel back to 1347, your nostrils would probably file for divorce. But in their own context, medieval folks weren't completely oblivious to cleanliness. They simply operated on a different scale of what counted as clean. They had systems. Even if those systems involved vinegar foot soaks and chamber pots hurled out windows. They had tools, lice combs, linen layers, vinegar rinses, herbs, ash-based soap. They had rituals, too, whether it was sponge bathing before Sunday Mass or boiling one's underwear during a full moon. Hygiene existed. It was just deeply interwoven with fear, faith, and whatever the weather was doing. In many ways, medieval people were doing the best they could with what they had, while also constantly trying not to anger God, the local baron, or their own armpits. The idea of regular full-body bathing was risky, time-consuming, and thanks to church doctrine and plague fears medically unwise, so they got invented. And surprisingly, some practices aged well. Linen undergarments were hygienically smart. Herb-infused water and vinegar rinses showed pretty solid antibacterial logic. Even communal bathhouses were effective until they turned into hot tubs of gossip and syphilis. Part 2. Ancient urban planning. Cities built by geniuses. Imagine walking through a city over 4,000 years old, the ancient jewel of the Indus Valley civilization. If you were expecting dusty huts scattered around random alleyways, think again. This place was so meticulously planned, it could make a modern city planner weep with professional envy. Constructed around 2500 BCE, Mohenjo-daro wasn't thrown together like a festival campsite. It was geometrically organized with the precision of someone who actually understood what a ruler was for. The city was laid out in a perfect grid pattern, actual blocks and right angles. Streets running north-south and east-west, intersecting cleanly to form a neat network of roads. It was as if the architects had used protractors and declared, let's keep this geometric, people. But the real magic wasn't just on the surface. Underneath those dusty roads was a system that even 21st century cities often fail to maintain drainage. Mohenjo-daro had an underground sewer system that would make Roman engineers jealous. Almost every house, no matter how small, had access to water and drainage facilities. Wastewater flowed from homes into covered drains running alongside the streets. You could almost hear the ancient residents saying, yes, actually, sanitation matters more than you think. The city wasn't just a giant bathroom with decorative bricks, though it was zoned with serious intention. There was a citadel built on a raised mound, probably home to administrative or religious elites. and a lower city where the general population lived. Public buildings like the famous Great Bath suggest that this wasn't just about survival. There was ritual, maybe even recreation, literally soaked into the clay bricks. If Mohenjo-daro was the tidy accountant of ancient cities, Babylon was the theatrical celebrity, flashy, vast, and absolutely drenched in myth-making. Babylon wasn't just a city, it was a symbol, a statement, a geopolitical flex that rose and fell many times over the centuries. In its prime around the 6th century BCE under Nebuchadnezzar II, Babylon was the glittering heart of Mesopotamia, and it knew it. This place was as carefully planned as it was majestic. Babylon was a walled city with massive gates, the most famous being the Ishtar Gate, adorned with dazzling blue tiles and sacred lions that looked like they belonged in a fever dream about divine architecture. At the center of Babylon's design was a sacred axis, a processional way that ran straight through the city. This wasn't just a road, it was a parade route for gods. Literally, Ben. Religious festivals like the Akitu New Year celebration would process along this street, linking the great Etemenanke ziggurat, which may or may not have inspired the story of the Tower of Babel, to the mighty temple dedicated to the god Marduk. Urban planning here was part piety, part propaganda. You didn't just live in Babylon, you walked its holy narrative every single day. The streets curved with the river and obeyed the land's natural contours, but they were also zoned smartly. There were residential quarters, temple complexes, gardens, markets, and administrative centers. The Euphrates River sliced through the city, providing not only water but also a navigable artery for trade, commerce, and let's be honest, showing off to visiting dignitaries. Even the bricks bore inscriptions of the king's name, because if you're going to build sewers, you might as well brand them. Roughly 1,000 years before the Aztecs marveled at its ruins and named it Teotihuacan, the place where gods were born. This ancient Mexican city was already flexing its urban design skills with the confidence of a civilization that had clearly read the manual on how to build cities that will blow people's minds for millennia. At its peak around 500 CE, Teotihuacan was one of the largest cities in the world, with a population north of 100,000. Unlike the chaotic sprawl of some modern megacities, this place was deliberately mapped out with the precision of a sacred geometry student who never forgot their protractor. The city's most iconic feature was the Avenue of the Dead. Despite its morbid name, thanks, Aztecs, it was less a cemetery and more a ceremonial boulevard stretching over 2 miles. This grand avenue wasn't an accident. It was a central axis aligned with astronomical events and flanked by temples, plazas, elite residences, and bustling market zones. Here's where things get even more sophisticated. Teotihuacan's bark layout was orthogonal, meaning the whole city followed a grid system tilted about 15.5 degrees off true north, possibly to align with specific celestial phenomena or sacred mountains. It wasn't random, it was cosmological. This was urban planning with a cosmic compass. Residential compounds were laid out in modular blocks, often housing multiple families with access to shared patios and drainage systems. Some compounds were highly decorated, indicating wealth, while others showed a more communal, working-class lifestyle. This wasn't just a city, it was organized society made visible in stone and stucco. When we talk about ancient urban planning, it's tempting to imagine a single mastermind, the ancient version of a city architect with a scroll and a grand vision. But in the Indus Valley civilization, it seems the planning came not from a ruler's decree, but from a cultural consensus so strong that multiple cities across the region shared shockingly similar features. These weren't sister cities, they were practically architectural clones. And that says something profound about human cooperation that we're still trying to figure out. Take Harappa, located in what is now modern-day Pakistan. Like Mohenjo-daro, it too was laid out in a grid-like pattern with uniform brick sizes, clear zoning for industrial, residential, and administrative use, and you guessed it, advanced drainage systems. Each home was connected to street drains via private chutes or underground terracotta pipes. This wasn't just sanitation, it was dignity by design. ensuring that even common citizens had clean facilities. Lothal, another Indus city near the Arabian Sea, added a new layer of sophistication port planning. Yes, Lothal had a dockyard, possibly the earliest known in the world, complete with a massive basin and sluice gates to control water levels. This wasn't just a riverside outpost, it was a shipping hub with infrastructure that anticipated tides and flow patterns. And you thought Venice was clever. What makes this even more remarkable is that there's no evidence of kings, palaces, or military fortresses, no statues of ruling elites, no epic inscriptions boasting about victories. Instead, the cities seem to have been run by efficient bureaucracies or councils focused on hygiene, trade, and ritual. Their power came from engineering, not empire. Artifacts like standardized weights and measures suggest a deeply regulated economy, with designated market areas and craft zones. You could almost imagine ancient planning committees arguing over warehouse placement and sewer width, because these decisions were made and they stuck across hundreds of miles. The real architects of the Indus cities weren't just building towns, they were shaping a society where order was embedded in every brick and where planning wasn't a privilege, it was a principle. When we think of zoning today, we picture bureaucrats arguing over parking permits and whether someone's Airbnb violates residential codes. But zoning dividing a city into designated areas for living, working, worshiping, and dumping your garbage isn't modern. It's ancient and surprisingly widespread. Cities like Mohenjo-daro, Babylon, and Teotihuacan weren't just random clusters of buildings. They were carefully orchestrated spaces, each with a logic behind the layout that would make modern city planners take notes. Let's start with Mohenjo-daro again. There, the raised citadel housed public baths, granaries, and possibly administrative buildings. Below it lay the residential quarters, with broad avenues separating different neighborhoods. Workshops and kilns were kept at the edges, probably because nobody wanted their home filled with smoke and the constant clanging of pottery wheels. It's zoning by common sense. But the impressive part is that this model repeated across Indus cities, suggesting a shared understanding of how urban space should work. Now jump over to Babylon. Babylonian zoning was driven not just by utility, but also by ritual and propaganda. Temples and palaces dominated the city's heart, linked by ceremonial roots. Administrative buildings and elite homes clustered nearby, while commoners and markets were pushed outward. But everyone, rich or poor, lived under the same city layout philosophy, organized, purposeful, and impressively sophisticated. Then there's Teotihuacan, where zoning reached almost surgical precision. The city's layout followed a strict grid, but each sector had a clear identity. There were residential compounds, craft production zones, market areas, and temple complexes, all coordinated like parts of a body. Some compounds even housed immigrants' entire neighborhoods of people from Oaxaca or the Gulf Coast, each built in the architectural style of their homeland. It was zoning plus multiculturalism in 500 CE. This level of spatial organization shows one critical thing. These weren't just cities. They were intentional societies. Urban space reflected values, whether spiritual, political, or economic. Where you lived, where you worked, where you worshipped, these were all pre-mapped by people who understood not only how humans move, but how they relate to each other. We love to imagine the ancient world as gloriously filthy, muddy streets, chamber pots, and the unmistakable perfume of unwashed crowds. But the truth is, some ancient cities cared a lot about sanitation. In fact, several had public hygiene systems that would make a 19th century European city blush with embarrassment. Let's return to Mohenjo-daro, our sanitation superstar. Nearly every house, regardless of bias, had its own private bathing area, complete with a sloped floor to drain water efficiently. Wastewater was channeled into covered street drains, yes, covered drains lined with bricks and equipped with access holes for cleaning. The drains ran along nearly every street, carrying waste away from the city. It was basically an early version of municipal plumbing, and it worked. This wasn't just clever, it was revolutionary. Compare that to Babylon, where hygiene was more symbolic than systematic. The city had canals and some drainage channels, and clay pipes carried water into palaces and temples. But for the average citizen, sanitation involved cesspits, open ditches, and divine forgiveness. Still, bathrooms were common, and wealthier homes had indoor plumbing using clay piping. Some records even describe a rudimentary flushing system, likely involving buckets and excellent timing. Now let's zoom into Teotihuacan. Though not as obsessed with drainage as the Indus Valley, Teotihuacan still featured carefully engineered stormwater canals and separate sewage systems in elite compounds. Many residential complexes had internal drains, and public buildings often had designated latrines. Cleanliness wasn't just about comfort, it was likely tied to religious purity, especially in ritual areas like temples or the Avenue of the Dead. Even smaller cities in the ancient world, like Lothal and Harappa, reflect a deep understanding of hydrology, with wells, reservoirs, and strategically sloped streets to prevent flooding. Imagine planning an entire town with gravity and seasonal monsoons in mind, then pulling it off in 2400 BCE. What makes all this impressive isn't just the technology, it's the mindset. These civilizations viewed water not just as a necessity, but as something to be channeled, shared, and respected. Hygiene wasn't a luxury for the elite, it was embedded in the urban design itself. If temples were where ancient people spoke to the gods, markets were where they negotiated with each other and likely argued over the price of onions. Every ancient city we've explored had a beating economic heart, and that heart pulsed in the form of carefully planned marketplaces, trade routes, and economic zoning. In Babylon, markets weren't a chaotic afterthought squeezed between temples. They were institutionalized, woven into the urban grid, and regulated by law. The Code of Hammurabi, one of the oldest known legal texts, devotes dozens of clauses to trade practices, weights, measures, and merchant behavior. Markets bustled with activity under porticos and in open-air squares. Grains, textiles, wine, slaves, and livestock changed hands while scribes tracked debts and transactions. This wasn't just shopping, it was commerce with legal infrastructure. Now shift to Teotihuacan, where things get even more fascinating. The city hosted enormous market plazas, especially near the Ciudadela complex, where thousands gathered to trade obsidian tools, cacao, feathers, ceramics, and salt. Unlike the highly centralized temple economies of some cultures, Teotihuacan's market system appeared decentralized and community-driven, with different neighborhoods specializing in specific crafts. Think of it as an ancient version of local Etsy shops, except your supplier lived in the next compound and might sacrifice a turkey to ensure good business. Meanwhile, in Mohenjo-Daro and other Indus cities, archaeologists have found evidence of dedicated market zones with wide avenues and adjacent warehouses. Standardized weights and scales suggest a robust system of regulation, while goods from as far away as Mesopotamia, including seals and precious stones, indicate that international trade was thriving. Imagine your neighborhood fishmonger accepting Mesopotamian currency and not even blinking. But it wasn't just about money. Markets were social hubs. In Babylon, they were places to catch gossip, settle disputes, and see who was wearing the latest Assyrian tunic. In Teotihuacan, they were multicultural melting pots where traders and travelers from distant lands mingled among pyramids and probably complained about the weather in different languages. In the ancient world, urban planning wasn't just about sewage systems and shopping districts, it was about the gods. Temples weren't hidden in quiet corners like modern churches might be. They dominated skylines, sat atop the city's highest points, and demanded prime real estate. If markets were the city's heartbeat, temples were its soul, and ancient planners made sure everyone knew it. Start with Babylon. The skyline was pierced by the Itamananki Ziggurat, a multi-tiered mountain of baked brick dedicated to the god Marduk. This wasn't a modest shrine, it was an architectural flex. Measuring around 91 meters high according to ancient sources, it was meant to bridge heaven and earth. And this wasn't just spiritual symbolism, it was centralized urban messaging. Roads led to the temple, Ceremonies revolved around it, and the entire city bowed architecturally and ritually to its divine core. Teotihuacan, too, placed its spiritual heart front and center. The Pyramid of the Sun and the Pyramid of the Moon weren't just ceremonial structures, they were urban anchors. The Avenue of the Dead connected these temples like a celestial highway, aligning with astronomical events and possibly even solstices. Everything from residential compounds to market spaces seemed to radiate out from these temples. They weren't background props, they were cosmic coordinates guiding both foot traffic and philosophy. And then there's Mohenjo-Daro, which didn't have towering ziggurats or pyramids, but instead gave us the Great Bath, a large public water tank likely used for ritual purification. This wasn't just a swimming hole, it was engineered with watertight bricks, a sophisticated drain system, and was possibly linked to spiritual practices of cleanliness and rebirth. No idol-lined sanctuaries here, just water, geometry, and sacred silence. In all these cities, sacred spaces were deliberately placed and functionally integrated. The temples weren't isolated, they were connected to processional roads, public courtyards, and administrative centers. Worship wasn't separate from life, it was life. Urban planning reflected this unity. It's tempting to think of modern cities as products of innovation, blueprints drawn by people with engineering degrees in TIAD software. But dig a little deeper, literally, and you'll find that the bones of urban life were laid thousands of years ago by planners without concrete, bulldozers, or civil engineering degrees. The DNA of city planning grids, zoning, sanitation, civic centers, religious spaces was already etched into the earth by people we often underestimate. Take drainage. Mohenjo-Daro didn't just throw down a few ditches and call it good. They designed an integrated, multi-level wastewater system that ran through homes and beneath streets. The concept of universal access to sanitation, still elusive in parts of the modern world, was standard in this Bronze Age metropolis. Babylon laid the groundwork for regulated commerce, civic infrastructure, and the symbolic use of space to reinforce power and religion. Teotihuacan gave us the template of the cosmic city, one where every road, plaza, and temple pointed to something bigger than the human eye could see. Its builders connected astronomy to architecture, embedding celestial rhythms into everyday movement. These weren't just settlements, they were philosophical blueprints. And then there's the psychological aspect. Ancient cities influenced behavior. Wide avenues allowed for processions and parades. Enclosed courtyards created communal spaces. Zoning wasn't just practical, it shaped how people interacted, how neighborhoods formed, and how authority was visualized. Modern urban planning owes much to this ancient foresight. Grids in Manhattan, sanitation systems in Amsterdam, temples turned into cathedrals, turned into town halls. Even the idea of a civic center comes from these ancestral cityscapes. We still measure property, we still design cities around access, trade, spirituality, and spectacle. What's changed is the technology, not the principles. So the next time you walk down a city street, remember you're not just moving through space, you're walking through 1,000 years of ideas, quietly whispering beneath your feet. Part 3, Hadrian, the philosopher emperor. Hadrian was not born in the heart of Rome, but on its distant western fringe. He came into the world in 76 CE in Italica, a Romanized town in the province of Hispania Baetica, modern-day southern Spain. Though geographically far from the capital, Hadrian's family was anything but provincial. They were wealthy, elite, and thoroughly Roman in culture and ambition. Most importantly, his father's side was related by blood to Marcus Ulpius Trajanus, the man who would later become Emperor Trajan. Hadrian lost both parents at around age 10, a formative tragedy that thrust him into the guardianship of Trajan and Publius alias Attianus, a Roman knight. These two men would shape the trajectory of his life in ways that would echo across the empire for decades. While many young nobles were steered toward military careers or political glad-handing, Hadrian gravitated toward Greek literature, philosophy, and the arts. He spoke Greek fluently, read Homer obsessively, and preferred a scroll to a sword, at least early on. This intellectual bent would earn him the nickname Graculus, Little Greek in his youth, which wasn't exactly a compliment in Roman society, but Hadrian wore it like a badge of honor. Rome, of course, didn't run on poetry and philosophical debates, so Hadrian, like all ambitious Roman aristocrats, had to earn his place through service. He began as a military tribune, first in Lower Moesia, then in Upper Moesia, and finally in Pannonia. He proved himself a competent officer, but his deeper talents lay in administration and statecraft skills that would serve him well when the purple cloak finally landed on his shoulders. Trajan's rise to the emperorship in 98 CE marked a turning point for Hadrian. Though their relationship was sometimes strained, Hadrian was known for being sharp-tongued, arrogant, and a bit too intellectual for some tastes. Trajan nonetheless kept him close. Hadrian became a quaestor, then tribune of the plebs, and steadily climbed the cursus honorum, Rome's ladder of political advancement. He also married well. His bride was Vivia Sabina, Trajan's grandniece, a politically strategic union that was about as romantic as a tax audit. The marriage was likely loveless and distant, as Hadrian's personal interests leaned more toward philosophical companionship and male intimacy, especially in the case of his later beloved Antinous. When Emperor Trajan fell gravely ill in 117 CE, the question of succession became urgent and murky. Though Hadrian had long served in the imperial orbit, his claim to the throne wasn't universally accepted. Trajan had never publicly named a successor, and the political elite were divided over whether Hadrian, the aloof intellectual from Hispania, was truly the right man to lead Rome. Trajan died in Selinus, in Asia Minor, far from the capital. Conveniently or suspiciously within days, a letter arrived in Rome stating that Trajan had adopted Hadrian as his son on his deathbed, witnessed by Trajan's wife Plotina and the ever-loyal Adrianus. The timing was impeccable. Some senators whispered a forgery, others suspected that Plotina had orchestrated the whole affair, favoring Hadrian's administrative mind over the more militaristic candidates. Regardless of the circumstances, the Senate ratified Hadrian's accession, and he became emperor on August 11, 117 CE, but the transition was far from smooth. Almost immediately, Hadrian faced multiple crises. The empire had overextended under Trajan's military campaigns, particularly in Mesopotamia, where rebellion was brewing like a slow-cooked disaster. Rather than continue aggressive expansion, Hadrian made the pragmatic and deeply unpopular choice to withdraw from Trajan's eastern conquests, including Armenia and Mesopotamia. This angered many senators and military men who had bled for those victories. Hadrian was accused of cowardice, even betrayal of Roman honor, and then came the bloodbath. Shortly after his ascension, 4 prominent senators who had openly opposed Hadrian's rise were executed under vague charges of conspiracy. Hadrian publicly denied involvement, blaming Adrianus, but few believed him. This act permanently tainted his relationship with the Senate. Even as he tried to govern with restraint and lawfulness, the message was clear: Hadrian could philosophize like a Greek, but he would rule like a Roman when pushed. Hadrian wasn't content to rule from the comfort of marble halls in Rome. Unlike most emperors, who viewed the empire as a distant abstraction managed through reports and messengers, he saw it as a living, breathing landscape, and he was determined to walk every inch of it. From the moment he secured his throne, Hadrian set out on what would become the most extensive traveling campaign in imperial history. Over the next 2 decades, he would log more miles than any emperor before or after him, turning governance into a mobile performance of presence and inspection. His first major tour began in 121 CE and lasted nearly 5 years. He traveled through Gaul, Germania, Britannia, Hispania, Africa, the Balkans, Greece, and Asia Minor, not by luxurious chariot, but often on foot alongside his soldiers. It was part leadership, part spectacle, and entirely unprecedented. In Britannia, Hadrian witnessed firsthand the instability along Rome's northern frontier. The Caledonian tribes, future Scots, were relentless, and Rome had pushed too far into territory it couldn't effectively hold. Hadrian opted to pull back and fortify, and the result was his most famous legacy, Hadrian's Wall, a 73-mile stone barrier stretching across northern England. It wasn't just military engineering, it was psychological warfare, a statement of limits. Rome would defend what it had rather than reach endlessly for more. In Africa, he inspected fortresses and addressed infrastructure needs. In Asia Minor, he funded public works and temples. In Egypt, he was treated like a living lion, nearly drowned in the Nile. Everywhere he went, he tied the empire together through personal appearances, policy adjustments, and architectural patronage. But his favorite stop was always Greece. Hadrian adored Hellenic culture, its language, philosophy, and aesthetics. He participated in the Eleusinian mysteries, patronized philosophers, and even earned that nickname Graeculus in his youth, which he embraced rather than rejected. In Athens, he financed the completion of the Temple of Olympian Zeus, began construction of the Library of Hadrian, and sought to revive the Pan-Hellenic League, uniting Greek cities under cultural pride rather than political domination. Hadrian didn't just walk the empire, he reimagined it in stone, brick, and marble. He was a builder by passion, not just policy, and his reign marked a golden age of imperial architecture, where concrete and marble became tools of philosophy, power, and cultural fusion. Perhaps his most iconic contribution within Rome itself was the Pantheon, rebuilt under his orders around 126 CE. While Agrippa's earlier version had burned down, Hadrian's vision transformed it into one of the most enduring buildings in human history. With its massive dome and oculus open to the sky, the Pantheon became a marvel of Roman engineering and a symbol of the heavens touching the earth. It was religious, geometric, cosmic, and deeply Hadrianic in its blend of technical mastery and philosophical ambition. Then there was his villa at Tivoli, a sprawling complex east of Rome that became both retreat and laboratory. Unlike typical imperial villas, Hadrian's estate was a curated architectural portfolio. It replicated famous landmarks from across the empire, Egyptian colonnades, Greek stoas, and even a miniature canal modeled on the Nile. This wasn't a villa, it was a philosopher king's dreamscape, a statement that Rome encompassed all worlds and could synthesize them into something entirely new. Across the provinces, he launched massive infrastructure campaigns. In Athens, he completed the Temple of Olympian Zeus, a project that had been abandoned for centuries. In North Africa, he funded roads, aqueducts, and granaries. In Asia Minor and the Levant, he rebuilt cities ravaged by earthquakes. In Jerusalem, he controversially refounded the city as Aelia Capitolina, sparking outrage among the Jewish population, an act that would have violent consequences later. Hadrian's architectural style was as eclectic as his travels. He loved arches, symmetry, and domes, but he also incorporated Greek aesthetics, Egyptian motifs, and local materials. He didn't force Roman identity on the provinces, he wove their traditions into imperial fabric, creating a visual language that was both unified and diverse. Among the many people who walked beside Hadrian during his travels, none would leave a deeper emotional imprint than Antinous, a beautiful young man from Bithynia in Asia Minor. Their relationship, tender, controversial, and ultimately tragic, would shape the emperor's personal mythology and produce one of the most unusual cults in Roman history. Antinous first appears in Hadrian's life around 124 CE, likely as a teenage companion. Described in ancient sources as stunningly handsome, quiet, and devoted, Antinous became Hadrian's favorite, accompanying him on journeys throughout the empire, especially in Greece and Egypt. Their relationship, while never officially defined, was widely understood to be romantic, a bond that stood out for its intensity and public visibility in a society where imperial relationships were usually carefully managed affairs. But in 130 CE, tragedy struck with the sudden finality that defines all human love stories. While sailing along the Nile, Antinous drowned under mysterious circumstances. The details remain vague. Some say it was an accident, others whisper of ritual sacrifice, and still others suggest suicide. Whatever the truth, Hadrian was devastated in a way that shattered imperial protocol. He openly mourned his companion in ways no Roman emperor had ever done before. His grief was public, passionate, and enduring, a display of emotion that shocked the Roman elite and revealed the human heart beating beneath imperial armor. What followed was one of the most extraordinary acts of imperial memorial in history. Hadrian deified Antinous, founding a city near the site of his death, Antinopolis, and establishing cults in his honor throughout the empire. Statues of the young man were commissioned by the hundreds, his image always idealized and serene, becoming a new icon of beauty and divine youth. Temples, coins, festivals, and even oracles were devoted to Antinous. In many ways, he became a kind of pagan saint, a god of grief, rebirth, and male beauty. No imperial lover had ever been honored like this. And for Hadrian, it wasn't political theater. It was personal mythology written in stone and marble across continents. Hadrian's reign, though often marked by art, philosophy, and peaceful travel, was not without fire, and none burned hotter than the Bar Kokhba revolt, the most violent Jewish uprising against Roman rule. It would test the emperor's patience, reveal his ruthless streak, and leave deep scars on the province of Judea that would never fully heal. The seeds of rebellion were sown when Hadrian, in an effort to unify the empire under Roman civic religion, attempted to refound Jerusalem as a Roman colony called Aelia Capitolina, named after his own family name and dedicated to Jupiter. To make matters worse, he reportedly planned to build a temple to Jupiter on the ruins of the Second Temple, Judaism's holiest site. Whether this was cultural insensitivity or deliberate provocation, it was seen by the Jewish population as nothing less than sacrilege. In 132 CE, rebellion erupted under the leadership of Simon Bar Kokhba, a charismatic and militant figure hailed by some as the Messiah. His forces quickly overwhelmed Roman garrisons and retook Jerusalem, establishing a short-lived Jewish state. For 2 years, Bar Kokhba ruled as a de facto prince, minting coins and enforcing Jewish law in direct defiance of Roman authority. Hadrian, initially caught off guard by the scale and intensity of the uprising, responded with cold, strategic fury. He summoned his best generals, including Julius Severus, recalled from Britain, and amassed an overwhelming force. What followed was brutal counter-insurgency warfare that made Hadrian's philosophical pretensions seem like distant memories. Roman troops crushed village after village, deploying scorched earth tactics, siege warfare, and mass executions. No mercy was shown to rebels or civilians suspected of aiding them. The countryside became a graveyard of burnt settlements and abandoned towns. By 135 CE, the revolt was over. Bar Kokhba was dead, his followers scattered or enslaved. The province was devastated. Over 500,000 Jews were killed according to Roman sources, and countless others were enslaved and scattered across the empire. Judea was renamed Syria Palestina, a deliberate move to erase Jewish ties to the land. Jewish religious practices were restricted, and the population was forbidden to enter Jerusalem. After years of restless travel, monumental construction, and episodes of both diplomacy and brutality, Hadrian began to slow down. The final phase of his life was marked by illness, melancholy, and the deepening realization that even emperors cannot master mortality. By 133 CE, Hadrian was suffering from a chronic illness, likely a form of heart disease or kidney failure based on ancient descriptions of his bloating, weakness, and difficulty breathing. The man who had walked the empire in sandals now rarely left his villa, and the philosopher king grew increasingly reclusive and morbid. He grew irritable, depressed, and obsessed with his own death, beginning to compose poetry about mortality that was often bleak and introspective. One of his most famous verses is a whispered farewell to his soul, Animula, Vegula, Blandula, a reflection on the fragility of life and the limits of power. But as his body failed, he still had one final imperial duty: naming a successor. Hadrian had no biological children, and his political instincts were clouded by personal affection and poor judgment. In 106 CE, he adopted Lucius Caionius Commodus, known as Lucius Aelius Caesar, a relatively obscure senator with a reputation for charm, but questionable health. Many were puzzled by the choice. The man was stylish, possibly soft, and clearly not built for the rigors of imperial rule. Their doubts were justified just months after his adoption. Aelius died suddenly, probably from tuberculosis. Hadrian was devastated and once again scrambling to find a suitable heir with time running out. With his own death approaching, he turned to a more traditional choice, Titus Aurelius Antoninus, a respected, moderate senator with a reputation for competence and stability. In 138 CE, Hadrian adopted Antoninus. But with a crucial twist, he demanded that Antoninus in turn adopt Marcus Annius Verus, the young man who would later become Marcus Aurelius, the philosopher emperor. In this one act, Hadrian effectively engineered the next two generations of stable leadership, ensuring a smooth transition that would usher in an unprecedented period of peace and prosperity. When Hadrian died in 138 CE at age 62, he left behind not an empire expanded, but one far more secure, cohesive, and intellectually vibrant than he had found it. His reign was defined not by conquest like Trajan's, but by consolidation, and that, in hindsight, was a revolutionary act in an age obsessed with outward glory and territorial expansion. Hadrian had the clarity and audacity to look inward. The most visible reminders of his rule still stand today. Hadrian's Wall, stretching across northern Britain, became a symbol of imperial strength achieved not through aggression, but through boundaries. It declared, "This is Rome, and that is not." It wasn't just military engineering, it was philosophy made manifest in stone. In the capital, his reconstruction of the Pantheon changed architectural history. Its vast dome, still the largest unreinforced concrete dome in the world, was a temple not just to the gods, but to the possibilities of Roman engineering and imagination. It remains the physical embodiment of Hadrian's intellect, precise, timeless, and open to the sky. His villa at Tivoli, with its libraries, water gardens, and recreated temples from across the empire, became the model for Renaissance palaces centuries later. It was Hadrian's dream of the world, an empire reduced to art and landscape, where different cultures could coexist in engineered harmony. But Hadrian's legacy wasn't only made of stone, it was also etched in policy and precedent. He reformed Roman law, reorganized the military without constant warfare, and professionalized provincial administration. He visited his provinces not to dazzle them with imperial spectacle, but to understand them, leaving behind a new model of imperial responsibility. Culturally, his love of Greek philosophy, poetry, and sculpture helped spark a revival of Hellenic traditions across the Roman world. The man once mocked as Graiculus had effectively re-Hellenized the empire not by force, but by taste and example. Part 4, Lewis and Clark, Chasing Jefferson's Dream. In 1803, President Thomas Jefferson doubled the size of the United States with the stroke of a pen and a check that would make modern real estate investors weep with envy. The Louisiana Purchase, a $15 million deal with France, added over 800,000 square miles of mostly uncharted wilderness to the young republic. It was a geopolitical coup of staggering proportions, but also a massive cartographic question mark. What exactly had America just bought? Mountains, deserts, water routes, mythical creatures, hostile tribes, friendly tribes, gold, nothing but mud. Jefferson had no clue, but he was determined to find out. The purchase was like buying a house sight unseen, except the house was larger than most European countries and might or might not contain monsters. Enter Meriwether Lewis, Jefferson's personal secretary, and a man with an insatiable appetite for adventure and scientific notebooks. Jefferson handpicked him to lead an expedition to explore the new territory, map its geography, document its flora and fauna, and most importantly, determine if a water route to the Pacific or the mythical Northwest Passage actually existed or was just wishful thinking by armchair geographers. But Lewis wasn't going alone into the vast unknown. He chose his old friend and military comrade William Clark as co-leader, creating one of history's most successful partnerships. While Lewis had a mind for science and diplomacy, Clark brought military discipline, cartographic skills, and an easy rapport with men that would prove essential for maintaining morale during the inevitable moments of despair. They would be equal leaders despite the fact that only Lewis held a formal commission, a diplomatic fiction that worked because both men were mature enough to check their egos at the expedition tent flap. Their preparations began immediately. Jefferson provided detailed instructions, observed the landscape, established trade relationships with native tribes, study plant and animal life, assert American presence in lands already occupied by dozens of indigenous nations, and do it all without starting any wars. It was subtle diplomacy wrapped in scientific curiosity, with a healthy dose of territorial ambition. Supplies were gathered with the methodical precision of people who understood they wouldn't see a proper store for 2 years' compasses, sextants, microscopes, gifts for native leaders' beads, mirrors, peace medals, medical supplies, weapons, and even a collapsible iron frame boat that looked impressive on paper but would prove utterly useless in practice. On May 14, 1804, the Corps of Discovery pushed off from the banks of the Missouri River near St. Louis, beginning what would become a 2-year odyssey into lands few Americans had ever seen. Their departure was surprisingly quiet, no parades, no cheering crowds, just 33 men in a keelboat and 2 pirogues hauling nearly 10 tons of supplies upstream into the wild unknown. Their progress was immediately humbling. The Missouri River, while serving as their main highway westward, was deceptively treacherous, a writhing, muddy serpent that seemed determined to test their resolve. Shifting sandbars, powerful currents, and dense forests along the banks made travel a daily grind of back-breaking labor. The men used poles, ropes, oars, and sheer determination to inch forward against the flow. At times, progress felt like rowing through wet cement while the river mocked their efforts. The crew consisted of hardened frontiersmen, expert hunters, French-Canadian boatmen, and a few soldiers with more grit than polish. Among them were York, Clark's enslaved servant, whose strength and charisma would later earn him deep respect from native tribes, and Charles Floyd, a sergeant whose fate would remind them all how fragile life on the frontier could be. The team quickly fell into a disciplined routine that would serve them well in the months ahead. Clark, ever the meticulous cartographer, mapped every bend in the river with obsessive precision. Lewis, the natural scientist, cataloged flora, fauna, and geological features, collecting samples and describing everything from catfish to mosquitoes with the enthusiasm of someone who genuinely loved his work. Every day brought encounters with new creatures, some majestic like bald eagles and elk, others less welcome. Gnats, ticks, and biting flies became daily tormentors, turning the romantic notion of wilderness exploration into an itchy, sweaty reality. By late summer, they had reached what is now Iowa and South Dakota, where the landscape transformed into sweeping prairies under an endless sky that made them feel simultaneously insignificant and exhilarated. It was here they had their first significant diplomatic meetings with native tribes, including the Otoe and Missouri, and later the more formidable Teton Sioux. By the time autumn 1804 crept across the Great Plains, the Missouri River had begun to slow under the weight of the coming freeze. The Corps of Discovery had traveled over 1,000 miles from St. Louis, and they knew they wouldn't make it to the Rocky Mountains before snow sealed the way west. It was time to pause, regroup, and survive what promised to be a brutal winter. They chose a spot near present-day Washburn, North Dakota, just downstream from a cluster of Mandan and Hidatsa villages. These native communities had long established permanent earth lodge settlements along the river, agriculturally rich, socially sophisticated, and strategically placed. The Mandan were already seasoned diplomats, having hosted French, British, and Spanish traders over the years. The Americans were just the latest strangers with strange hats and questionable fashion sense. Here, Lewis and Clark ordered the men to build a winter fort, Fort Mandan, named in honor of their hosts. It rose from the frozen prairie like a wooden statement of intent they were here to stay, at least until spring liberated them from winter's grip. Constructed of cottonwood logs, the fort featured high walls, blockhouses, and cramped rooms for over 30 men. It was more drafty than comfortable, but it kept the howling winds at bay, and those winds were absolutely merciless. Temperatures often plunged below 0 Fahrenheit, turning simple tasks into exercises in survival. Frostbite was a daily threat, and the men learned to respect the prairie winter's ability to kill the careless. Yet life inside Fort Mandan was far from idle. Lewis and Clark were obsessively recording data, everything from temperature readings to tribal languages to the exact number of corn kernels in a local cob. Most crucially, it was at Fort Mandan that they met Toussaint Charbonneau, a French-Canadian trapper, and his young Shoshone wife, Sacagawea. Though Charbonneau was hired as a translator, it was Sacagawea, pregnant at the time, who would become an indispensable guide in the months ahead. Her knowledge of Western geography and ability to communicate with native tribes would prove more valuable than any musket or map. Relations with the Mandan were mostly peaceful, though tensions occasionally rose like steam from the earth lodges. Cultural misunderstandings, resource scarcity, and sheer proximity made friction inevitable. Still, the Corps knew that without native cooperation, their mission could end right there in the snow, buried under the weight of winter and their own ignorance. By spring 1805, with journals full, gear repaired, and Sacagawea's newborn son, Jean-Baptiste, swaddled and ready for adventure, the Corps dismantled Fort Mandan. The next phase of their journey into the unknown beyond the plains and toward the Rockies was about to begin. In April 1805, the Corps of Discovery left behind the relative safety of Fort Mandan and re-entered the unpredictable wilderness. They now traveled lighter, with a smaller party and greater urgency. The winter's enforced pause was over, and ahead lay the real test of their mission, finding that elusive water route to the Pacific. Spring brought beauty, but also blood-sucking torment. The Missouri River teemed with mosquitoes that harassed the men relentlessly, turning sleep into an interrupted nightmare of swatting and cursing. Bison, deer, and bear became more plentiful, which was excellent for hunting, but also meant increased vigilance against creatures that could end your expedition with one bad encounter. It was during this stretch that the expedition experienced its first near disaster, while attempting to retrieve a capsized pirogue containing irreplaceable supplies. Sacagawea calmly rescued critical items, including Clark's journals and maps, earning even deeper respect from the men. She wasn't just a translator or guide, she was a stabilizing force, cool under pressure, adaptable, and fiercely capable. By June, the Corps reached the Great Falls of the Missouri, not one waterfall, but a series of 5 spectacular cascades stretching across 18 miles of river. It was a magnificent natural wonder and an absolute nightmare to portage. The men spent nearly a month hauling boats and supplies overland around steep cliffs and jagged terrain, using homemade carts and brute strength that would make modern CrossFit enthusiasts weep. Some called it the expedition's most physically grueling challenge, and they weren't wrong. Every step was earned through sweat, curses, and the kind of determination that separates successful explorers from historical footnotes. Still, spirits lifted when Lewis spotted the snow-capped Rocky Mountains in the distance. That moment, inspiring and terrifying in equal measure, also brought a crushing realization. The team had assumed the Rockies would be like the gentle, rolling Appalachians they knew from back east. They were catastrophically wrong. These were monstrous peaks that would soon dash all hopes of a continuous river route to the Pacific. But hope came in an unexpected form: Sacagawea's people, the Shoshone. When the Corps finally made contact, an astonishing reunion unfolded that seemed too perfect to be anything but providence. The chief, Kamehameha, turned out to be Sacagawea's brother, a moment of pure luck that shifted everything in their favor. The Shoshone agreed to provide horses, supplies, and guides crucial for crossing the Bitterroot Mountains, where no boat could possibly go. The Missouri had taken them as far as water could carry them. Now the real climb began. Crossing the Rocky Mountains was never going to be easy. But even the most pessimistic predictions couldn't prepare the Corps of Discovery for the brutal reality of the Bitterroot Range, with the Missouri River behind them and the Pacific still tantalizingly out of reach. The expedition now had to abandon their boats and march on horseback, hauling what they could over narrow, icy trails that seemed designed to test human endurance. Armed with Shoshone horses and guides, the Corps began their trek across the Bitterroot Mountains in early September 1805. The terrain was absolutely merciless, jagged ridges, steep ravines, and thick forests that made every step a battle against gravity and despair. The trails were often nothing more than game paths winding through fog, snow, and wind-blasted passes that offered no shelter and less comfort. But the worst enemy wasn't the terrain, it was hunger. Game was nearly non-existent in these high elevations. The men resorted to eating candles, soup made from bear fat, and eventually horse meat. Journals from this period become haunted by food, reduced to grim catalogs of what was edible and what was simply desperation made manifest. Men collapsed from exhaustion, their moccasins disintegrating on the rocky trails. Frostbite crept into fingers and toes with the stealth of a predator. One of the most harrowing sections was Lolo Pass, where the party trudged through snowdrifts while gnawing on boiled roots and shredded hides. Clark wrote that they were entirely out of provisions and subsisting on horse meat, a diet that would make modern survival experts cringe. It was, quite simply, the lowest physical point of the entire journey. Men questioned whether they would survive, whether the mission was worth their lives, whether they had pushed too far into a wilderness that didn't want them there. And yet, somehow, they didn't give up. When they finally emerged from the mountains near present-day Idaho, stumbling and starving, the Corps encountered the Nez Perce tribe. The Nez Perce could have easily wiped them out. The expedition was in no condition to resist, but instead, they nursed the starving men back to health with fish, camas root, and the kind of hospitality that reminded the Corps that human kindness could exist even in the wilderness. It was another miraculous turn of fate, another reminder that indigenous hospitality, not just American grit, made this expedition possible. While resting with the Nez Perce and slowly regaining their strength, Lewis and Clark reflected on what lay ahead. They were battered, frostbitten, and malnourished, but they were also within reach of the Columbia River Basin, and that meant one thing: the Pacific was finally near. With the Rocky Mountains behind them like a nightmare, they'd somehow survive, and winter closing in with meteorological determination. The Corps of Discovery began building dugout canoes from towering ponderosa pines. Thanks to Nez Perce assistance and expertise, their next target was the Columbia River, the mighty waterway that would carry them west toward the Pacific Ocean and the end of their long, painful march. But if they thought paddling would be easier than mountain crossing, they were in for a wet, violent surprise. The Columbia River was no lazy, meandering stream. It was fast, rocky, and moody, seeming to fight their very existence with every rapid and hidden boulder. The canoes were heavy and often unstable, especially loaded with the full weight of gear. Journals, specimens, and human exhaustion accumulated over months of travel. Treacherous rapids threatened to flip boats and drown precious cargo with the indifference of natural forces that don't care about human ambitions. More than once, men nearly died, saved only by quick reflexes and the kind of luck that separates successful expeditions from cautionary tales. Along the way, they encountered several Chinookan and Sahaptian-speaking tribes whose societies were rich in trade networks, especially centered around salmon, a staple food that swam in impossible abundance during spawning season. The Corps marveled at the sophisticated fishing methods, carved plank houses, and beautifully detailed canoes that put their own crude dugouts to shame. These tribes were savvy, experienced, and understandably wary of newcomers. Diplomacy remained as delicate as navigating the rapids. Some tribes welcomed the strangers with curiosity and hospitality. Others viewed them as unwanted intruders inching closer to their world, bringing unknown diseases and unpredictable changes. The farther west they traveled, the more the environment transformed. Rain fell with merciless regularity, turning the lush forests of what is now Washington and Oregon into a beautiful but cold, damp, and utterly relentless green cathedral. Clothing molded in the constant moisture, gunpowder became unreliable. The journals of Lewis and Clark during this period read like diaries from a soggy purgatory where even optimists began to question their life choices. Finally, In mid-November 1805, after 18 months of hardship that had tested every aspect of their endurance, the Corps reached the mouth of the Columbia River, and there, through the gray, stormy mist that seemed to define this coast, they caught their first glimpse of the Pacific Ocean. The moment should have been triumphant, the culmination of Jefferson's dream and their own extraordinary sacrifice. But it was anything but romantic. Their hastily constructed camp near present-day Astoria, Oregon, was a muddy mess of wind, rain, and despair that would have broken lesser spirits. Reaching the Pacific Ocean in November 1805 should have marked a victory lap for the Corps of Discovery. But the ocean was decidedly not in a festive mood, and neither was the weather. Torrential rain, freezing temperatures, and relentless coastal storms turned their hard-earned reward into a damp, muddy nightmare that lasted for months. With little choice but to hunker down and wait for winter to pass, the expedition built a crude shelter on the south side of the Columbia River, naming it Fort Clatsop after the local Clatsop tribe. The winter of 1805 to 1806 became a test of mental endurance that rivaled any physical challenge they had faced. It rained every single day except for 12. According to Clark's meticulous notes, a statistic that probably made him question his dedication to record keeping. The men's clothing rotted in the constant moisture. Lice and fleas ran rampant through their quarters, turning sleep into an exercise in futile scratching. Scurvy loomed as a constant threat, kept at bay only by whatever fresh food they could hunt or trade for. Elk became their primary food source, requiring daily hunting expeditions that often took them miles from camp through forests that seemed designed to disorient and exhaust. The meat was tough, lean, and barely enough to keep body and morale from collapsing entirely. Despite the miserable conditions, Lewis and Clark insisted on continued documentation with the obsessive dedication of scientists who understood they might never return to verify their observations. They detailed tribal customs, geography, weather patterns, plants, and animals, adding hundreds of pages to what would become an invaluable scientific record. Lewis meticulously described sea otters, while Clark improved the maps that would later guide generations of settlers westward. Even in misery, they remained passionate observers of the natural world. Interactions with local tribes were mixed and complicated. The Clatsop and Chinook peoples were accomplished traders with extensive networks up and down the Pacific coast. They were polite but not particularly enthusiastic about the Corps' presence, having dealt with European and American traders before. Negotiations over food or supplies often involved stern bargaining sessions, where the Americans learned that their trade goods weren't as impressive as they had hoped. And then there was the crushing boredom, trapped in a fort made of soggy logs, waiting for weather that never seemed to improve. The men passed time making salt from seawater, mending clothes that immediately began molding again, and carving wooden souvenirs that probably seemed like good ideas at the time. By March 1806, the Corps had had enough. With journals overflowing with observations, samples preserved as best they could manage, and their bodies thoroughly dampened and stiffened from months of Pacific Northwest hospitality, they burned their candles for the last time at Fort Clatsop, packed what little hadn't rotted, and turned their faces eastward. They had found the Pacific, proving that the continent could be crossed overland. Now came the real test, surviving the long, punishing return to civilization. In March 1806, the Corps of Discovery left Fort Clatsop with soaked clothing, exhausted bodies, and a singular goal that burned brighter than any campfire get home. They had accomplished what no other Americans had done reaching the Pacific overland, but the journey back would prove just as perilous, just as draining, and in some ways more psychologically challenging than the outbound trip. The wilderness they had once entered with curiosity and excitement now loomed with a different energy. It was familiar, but still utterly unforgiving. They retraced their steps up the Columbia River, struggling once again with high currents, steep cliffs, and increasingly tense interactions with native-wise tribes who had grown more cautious about American intentions. Supplies ran dangerously low. Trade became more difficult as tribes demanded higher prices for food and horses, perhaps sensing that these Americans represented the advance guard of changes they didn't welcome. The romantic notion of wilderness exploration had long since given way to the grinding reality of survival. By late spring, the Corps made it back across the Bitterroot Mountains with better weather and smarter preparation this time, though it remained a grueling test of endurance that reminded them why they had nearly died there the first time. When they reached the Nez Perce villages, they were welcomed like old friends returning from a long journey. The tribe had safely kept their horses as promised and helped the Corps prepare for the next leg of their homeward journey. Then Lewis and Clark made a bold decision that increased their risks, but also their potential discoveries. They would split the expedition into smaller groups to explore more territory and fill in gaps in their mapping. Lewis headed north toward the Marias River, hoping to chart its connection to the Missouri and extend American territorial claims. Clark followed the Yellowstone River, mapping its course and searching for easier routes through the plains. It was a risky move that violated basic wilderness safety principles. Communication between groups would be impossible, and if either group encountered serious trouble, they would be on their own. But the potential scientific and political gains seemed worth the danger. Lewis's path turned nearly fatal when his group encountered Blackfeet warriors in late July. What initially appeared to be a friendly meeting grew suspicious when the warriors saw the Americans' firearms and trade goods, clearly intended for rival tribes. One tense night turned deadly when a skirmish broke out over horses and weapons. 2 Blackfeet men were killed, the only violent deaths directly caused by the expedition. Lewis's party fled under cover of darkness, shaken and wounded, knowing they had made enemies in territory they might need to cross again. Clark's group had a slightly less dramatic return, though not without its share of injuries, equipment failures, and encounters with bison stampedes that reminded them the Great Plains could kill you just as efficiently as the mountains. By August 1806, the 2 groups reunited near the Missouri River. The expedition was whole again, but the mood was somber rather than celebratory. The thrill of discovery had passed, replaced by the grim determination of experienced travelers who just wanted to see home again. By late August 1806, the Missouri River once again pulled the core of discovery downstream, this time carrying them toward home rather than mystery. Their bodies were thinner, their uniforms in tatters, and their journals swollen with mud-stained pages. But they had survived an odyssey that had tested every aspect of human endurance. On September 23, 1806, the expedition finally returned to St. Louis, greeted not with fanfare but with stunned awe. Many had presumed them dead, victims of the wilderness that had swallowed so many previous expeditions. In just over 2 years, Lewis and Clark had traveled over 8,000 miles, crossed mountains that had nearly killed them, navigated roaring rivers, made contact with more than 50 native tribes, and recorded hundreds of new plant and animal species. They had mapped vast portions of the continent with astonishing accuracy and established a firm American presence in lands long claimed by indigenous nations, Britain and Spain. The expedition was immediately hailed as a triumph of American courage and scientific achievement. Newspapers celebrated their survival and discoveries with the kind of enthusiasm usually reserved for military victories. President Jefferson, who had watched anxiously for news of his hand-picked explorers, was elated. The Louisiana Purchase had been vindicated, and America's westward expansion now had a roadmap written in rivers, mountains, and carefully documented trails. Yet despite their heroic status, the post-expedition fates of Lewis and Clark diverged sharply, illustrating how fame and success can affect different people in dramatically different ways. Meriwether Lewis was appointed governor of the Louisiana Territory, a position that should have crowned his achievements with political success. Instead, he struggled with depression, alcoholism, and mounting debts that seemed to grow faster than his ability to manage them. The transition from wilderness explorer to territorial administrator proved far more difficult than crossing the Rockies. Just 3 years after the expedition's triumphant return, in 1809, Lewis died under mysterious circumstances at a remote inn along the Natchez Trace. Whether by suicide or murder remains debated by historians. But his death cast a permanent shadow over the mission he had once led with such precision and purpose. William Clark, on the other hand, thrived in civilian life. He became governor of the Missouri Territory and superintendent of Indian Affairs, remaining an influential voice in Western expansion for decades. He named his firstborn son Meriwether Lewis Clark, a tribute to his fallen friend and partner that honored their extraordinary bond. And what of the expedition's other key figures? Sacagawea returned west with her husband and child. Her exact fate remains debated by historians, but her symbolic role in American memory only grew larger as the expedition's legend expanded. York, Clark's enslaved servant, who had become a legend among the native tribes for his strength and humor, faced a painful irony despite his contributions to one of America's greatest adventures. Clark refused to free him for many years, a reminder that even heroic expeditions can carry the contradictions of their time. The expedition's legacy is both heroic and deeply complicated, embodying the contradictions that would define American expansion for the next century. Lewis and Clark opened the West to further exploration, trade, and settlement, but they also laid the groundwork for the systematic displacement of native peoples whose lands had been mapped without their consent. The detailed journals, accurate maps, and scientific observations provided by the Corps of Discovery became the foundation for waves of settlers, traders, and eventually the transcontinental railroad that would transform the American West. But every mile mapped was also a mile claimed. Every tribal contact a step toward the cultural collisions that would devastate indigenous communities. The story of Lewis and Clark is not just one of survival, scientific discovery, or even national expansion. It is a story of human ambition and resilience, of cultural collision and unintended consequences, of the high cost that often accompanies what we call progress. It reminds us that exploration is fundamentally human, the drive to know what lies beyond the horizon, to push against the boundaries of the known world. But it also reminds us that every act of discovery changes both the discoverers and the discovered, often in ways that take generations to fully understand. The Corps of Discovery succeeded in their mission to map a route to the Pacific, but they also set in motion forces that would reshape a continent. Their courage was real, their achievements extraordinary, but their legacy, like all human legacies, carries both the light of discovery and the shadows of consequence. And so, from the stench-filled streets of medieval Europe to the precisely planned cities of ancient civilizations, from Hadrian's philosophical wanderings across his empire to Lewis and Clark's muddy trek across an unknown continent, we see the same human drives playing out across millennia: the desire for cleanliness and order, the need to understand and control our environment, the urge to explore beyond the familiar, and the complex consequences that follow every human ambition. History, it turns out, is written not just in grand gestures and monumental buildings, but in the daily struggles of people trying to stay clean, build functional societies, and push beyond the boundaries of their known world: one medieval bath, one ancient sewer system, one philosophical emperor, and one muddy footstep at a time. And here we are, at the end of our journey through time's most fascinating contradictions. We've watched medieval Europeans turn bathing into an extreme sport, marveled at ancient civilizations that solved problems we're still working on today, followed a Roman emperor who tried to walk across the world, and trudged alongside explorers who somehow survived 2 years of eating their own shoes. What strikes me most about all these stories is how fundamentally human they are. Whether we're talking about a 14th century peasant trying to remove lice with a bone comb, an ancient Indus Valley engineer designing the world's first urban drainage system, Hadrian composing melancholy poetry in his twilight years, or Lewis and Clark arguing over whether to eat their last horse. These are all stories about people doing their best with what they had, while usually having no idea what they were actually doing. The medieval world wasn't dirty because people were ignorant. They were trying, in their own wonderfully misguided way, to stay healthy without understanding germs. Ancient cities weren't well planned by accident. They were designed by people who cared deeply about how humans should live together. Hadrian wasn't just wandering around the empire for fun. He was trying to figure out what it meant to rule responsibly. And Lewis and Clark weren't just lucky, they were determined, adaptable, and occasionally smart enough to listen to people who knew more than they did. In each era, people faced the same fundamental challenges we face today. How do we stay clean and healthy? How do we build cities that actually work? How do we balance power with responsibility? How do we explore new frontiers without destroying what we find there? The tools have changed, But the questions remain remarkably consistent. Perhaps that's the most comforting thing about history. It reminds us that humans have always been gloriously, ridiculously, admirably human. We've always been capable of both breathtaking genius and spectacular stupidity, often in the same afternoon. We've always struggled with hygiene, urban planning, leadership, and the consequences of our own curiosity. The next time you turn on a faucet, remember the anonymous engineers of Mohenjo-daro who figured out indoor plumbing 4,000 years ago. When you step into a hot shower, think about those medieval Europeans who genuinely believed you were inviting death through your pores. When you walk through a well-planned city, appreciate the invisible descendants of Babylon's urban designers. And when you check your GPS before a road trip, spare a thought for Lewis and Clark, who somehow navigated an entire continent using stars, rivers, and the kindness of strangers. We are all walking through history, adding our own small chapters to this ongoing human story. Someday, future people will look back at our time and find our customs just as bizarre, our solutions just as ingenious, and our blind spots just as obvious as those of every generation before us. But that's okay. That's what makes us human. We do our best with what we know. We build on what came before. We occasionally stumble upon something brilliant, and we muddle through with a combination of intelligence, luck, and stubborn determination that would make our ancestors proud. So whether you're dealing with modern plumbing problems, city planning headaches, leadership challenges, or just trying to figure out where you're going in life, remember you're participating in conversations that humans have been having for thousands of years. You're part of an ongoing experiment in civilization that includes everyone from anonymous Indus Valley city planners to emperors who love their boyfriends enough to make them lungs. Take comfort in the continuity. Take inspiration from the ingenuity. And maybe, just maybe, take a moment to appreciate that hot shower because trust me, medieval Europeans would have killed for what you can do with the turn of a handle. Thanks for joining me on this journey through time's most entertaining contradictions. Keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep remembering that no matter how sophisticated we think we've become, we're all just humans trying to figure it out as we go along. Until next time, stay curious, stay clean, and remember we're all part of the same gloriously messy human story. One footnote at a time.